can write the question. We can.
In the meantime, you basically have about 75 votes, I think. And so it's gonna take, you can see here in the bottom, it's very divided between pro-independence and anti-independence. So it might take a while until they decide on a president. If let me know, Juan, if anyone asks any questions. Just
I will let you know. Like, please continue.
So, and I live in the US, so when we say that there's no government, there's a very different concept. Everything shuts down in the government. There's furloughs. It's very messy, especially those who live in DC know that it can get messy during these periods of no government. And so I asked her, like, how are you gonna go to work if it's the public transportation gonna be working? And she said, no, everything just continues normally as it is. And I just couldn't understand how everything would continue normally as it is without a president, in the US. That would be like crazy. And so I started exploring this idea, and I'll show you basically what I found. First of all, an introduction of what a caretaker government is. It changes by country, the name, and to a certain extent the responsibilities. In some governments it's called caretaker. In Netherlands it's called the missionary. In the UK, provisional. And it's exclusive and universal to these parliamentary democracies where people don't exactly choose the president, but the Congress chooses the president. The parliament, chooses the president. So countries like Belgium, Spain, the UK, Netherlands, Italy, and Pakistan. In some countries, for example, like Pakistan, they have it mandatory. Every time there's an election, there's like a 3-month period between one government and the other. The goal of these governments are to basically run the government just as it is without any chaos happening, because there's lack of president. These caretaker governments cannot pass any laws. They cannot do like major significant legislation. Their only responsibility is literally to sign a law. Sign whatever comes to their desk that needs to be signed in order for the country to continue working as it is. These periods happen usually when there's a change of government and there's no president that is elected. In the case of Catalonia, for example, when they made a referendum and the King of Spain ended up kicking out the president of Catalonia. And so they put on a caretaker government. And so there's different ways that these governments arrive to power, and there's different ways that people elect this the parliament elects these caretaker presidents. Sometimes it's the actual president that was before the end of their period that continues being president. But again, they cannot sign any major legislation. They are just there to sign whatever needs to be signed for the government to continue working as it is.
Okay, Santiago, just to highlight what Dani was saying, he says, like, just had a comment. These results, the one you previously showed, I think are from February 2021 and are not just for Barcelona, but Catalonia as a whole. And only a fraction of the overall seats come from the Barcelona region. So just to clarify.
Sorry, yes, I think when I think of Catalonia, I think of Barcelona. That is wrong, but yes, you're correct. And it's 2021, not 2020. Okay. Sorry, I apologize. Thank you.
And Aja, if you want to do your comment, please open your mic.
Yeah, I was just making a comment that we were talking about, the continuity of the government and, how functions started to shut down. That in the US, we shut down because of like budgetary reasons, because we couldn't pass a budget, rather than electoral reasons, like not choosing a president. So I don't know if that matters for the purposes of this discussion.
Exactly. No, in this case, you're right. In the US, it's only for budgetary reasons, but it's still the only equivalent that we have in the US and other democracies in the Americas of a government shutting down. It's not common for a government to shut down. So that's my comparison, or that's how I thought of it when she said the government is shutting down. And I'm like, wait, so how are you gonna go to work? And that was my first reaction. Usually it varies, but on average, there's about a 39-day period where the caretaker governments in Europe last. And so the key underlying thing that I want to just highlight again is that because these governments, these caretaker governments, don't have democratic legitimacy, so nobody voted for them, that's why they cannot pass any legislation, and they must avoid any controversial or consequential decisions. And this is what Ajay, you just brought up. In the case of the US, it's when there's like a budget disagreement and they don't get to decide on a budget, and so there's like the government. I'm going to give the example of 2013. It was like almost a 1 month period where the government had shut down. There were over 1 million federal employees that didn't receive a paycheck. The good thing about the US is that it's customary once the government starts working again to pay back those employees. However, this also puts a little bit of pressures because like people are spending their savings and their credit cards, and there might be some economic impact there. Baker and Yanelis also said they looked at different households that were laid off in the US, and so they found that there's 10 to 20% reduction in household spending. And so you see that in the US, a government shutdown like impacts the economy, at least the local economy in some places. In Europe, it's a little bit different. Everything continues just as it is. I'm going to cite some articles from the Washington Post where a person said, the journalist said a government running an autopilot for a year, and then some Belgians haven't even noticed a difference. The trains keep running just as steadily as usual. And so what I really want to emphasize is that in Europe, it's different than the US. And so everything just continues as it is. And this is very important to understand then, is there an economic impact or not? This is a quote from that same article that says, if you're an ordinary citizen, it would be very difficult to see that we have a caretaker government right now. However, what is costing us money are problems that cannot be dealt with because we have no government. And same below, right? People are voting presidents because they want to address climate change, societal issues, poverty, unemployment. There's a lot of these issues, but when they don't come to agreement on a president, then there's no one to really pass this legislation that people have voted for because they thought it was urgent. There's also something that I discovered. There's different perceptions between citizens and politicians. Citizens are actually tend to be very happy with caretaker governments because everyone hates politicians. So when they're not there, everyone thinks everything is running perfectly. And these are some quotes from some New York Times articles about Spain. The first one is about Austria. So Berlin was the Austrian prime minister who was there in a caretaker position, and so everyone was very happy with her. This person said, this very important journalist said that Berlin simply does the work for which she is hired to do. There's also the case, I think it was in Ireland, that the president ended his presidency, and then during his caretaker government, his popularity just boosted. And then there's a New York Times article that interviews different people in Spain. And you can see the sentiment here is there's no government, so no thieves. Spain would just be fine if we got rid of most of the politicians. And so people are happy because there's no politicians and they hate politicians. On the other side, there's politicians who are left without a job. And so they keep pressing that, no, it's not good to have these caretaker governments. They take too long. And it's not good for the economy, right? Journalists like to hop into this discussion. They really like to side with the people, and you can see these are some of the articles that I was researching when I was first looking into caretaker governments, and you see that they're very quick to attribute any success of a caretaker government to the lack of politicians being in charge. It says Spain has no government for 10 months, the economy grows and employment falls. Spain hasn't had a government in 300 days and the economy is booming. Without a government for a year, Belgium shows that what happens to politics without politicians, and then no government, no problem, says Belgians. So the first thing that came to my mind as an economist here is like, I got an automatic trigger of, okay, what's the counterfactual though? It says economy grows, okay, but would have it grown without them? And so I started this journey to looking into finding a counterfactual and then comparing the actual trend to the counterfactual. This is just a comic that I found. On the left, the guy is saying no bad laws were passed today, no members of parliament made stupid comments, there's no like circus of politics. And then the woman on the right says, if caretaker government was an election choice, it would always get my vote. So this is just some of the sentiment going on, and this is what I'm trying to address. To, you know, on one side you have people claiming it's good, and other ones people claiming it's bad. So I want to address this situation. Why is this important? There's increased polarization in politics in Europe, all over the world, but in Europe especially. And so these caretaker government periods have been becoming more frequent, and not only more frequent, but longer in time. Belgium just left a couple of months ago, I think, a 2-year period without a president. They had a caretaker government. In that case, Belgium has a law that you can only spend on a given month during a caretaker government 1/12 of the entire budget last year. And so you see that you don't really have that space to adjust for tweaks that you have to do to the economy or whatever things that have to be done. In the case of Spain, during 2015 to 2021, there has been, I think it was 1 out of 3 days during those periods were under caretaker governments, and that is more time than the period before, since Franco's death to 2014. And so this Washington Post quote is actually very good. It says, indeed, voters tend to see outsider politicians, not governments run by caretakers, as the answer to problems with politics. So think about, for example, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. But in parliamentary systems like Belgium's, voting for candidates from non-traditional parties can increase likelihood of caretaker governments and continuation of the status quo. So you saw in Catalonia that there were many different parties, and a lot of those parties didn't have power before, so they didn't have the influence to affect the decision of a president.
So Santiago, before you continue, I have a question. I don't know if what your outcomes or what are you looking at after, but you mentioned perception, some perception and about the government, but this is like journalists asking someone, do you have data to measure that, any survey, or are you planning to get some data to measure that?
I don't have any. That's a good thing to consider. I'm using it more to actually to give an introduction to the topic, but I think that's very important. I will actually start looking for that. So right now, what the other issue that you said, the outcomes of interest. So this is basically the methodology. I analyze caretaker governments in 3 countries. These are the countries that had like the longest periods: Belgium with 500 plus days, Netherlands with 200 plus days, and Spain with 300 plus days. And there's other cases in Belgium where there were more than 500 days, but that collides with COVID, and so I didn't want to get into that. I'm going to use data from the OECD, and I'm going to use data on GDP. And then I'm going to use a synthetic control method from Abadi. So for those of you who do not know what a synthetic control is, I included an example below. You can see that on the left, that's a traditional method that economists used to do, where if you want to see how a country was affected by some intervention, you compare it to another one. There's some disadvantages when you're comparing countries, in that countries are not exactly the same. And so Abadi developed a way to, it's a weighted average of different countries. And so it's kind of saying, in the case of Belgium, Belgium somehow looks a little bit like Netherlands, a little bit like Germany and France in terms of its economy. And so the algorithm weights these different trends, and they come up with a closer synthetic control, a counterfactual that you can see on the right. And he gives an example with West Germany. It's increasingly being used, and I think it's ideal for this case. It's very difficult to compare one country to the other. And I'm going to use, I built a synthetic control for each of those countries based on only countries in Europe. And so that gives you like a closer, there's questions, you can use data from Japan to create a counterfactual for Spain, but again, there's questions of, okay, how valid is drawing that data from Japan and using it in Spain? And so I only close it to Europe, use data from Europe. So this is the case of Belgium, where there were like more than 100 days of caretaker governments during June 2010 to December 2011. You can see that the dotted line, the dashed line, is the synthetic control based on the different countries in Europe, and the treated unit is the actual GDP. And so what we're interested is looking at this period right before, this is the start of the caretaker government. So looking at this period right after the caretaker government, and you see that there's no spike or decrease, right? It's very much how the synthetic control had predicted it, the counterfactual had predicted it. So we don't see any evidence here that there is any impact to the GDP of these governments. Yes, Juan?
Yeah, Santiago, I think Aya has a question.
Yeah, I have a quick question about the synthetic control thing, because this is my first time seeing it. So how do you choose the weights? Is it just based on like how similar their GDP is or something, like between different countries, or,
That's an excellent question. The algorithm picks the weights for you, so that you don't really have to do anything, just insert the data. And the algorithm it's very long, it's very fancy. And it basically what it tries to do is like minimize the difference between the dashed line and the normal line before the intervention, right? And so you can assume here in this case, for example, because it is so close, the counterfactual is very close to the actual trend, you can assume that after the intervention, this counterfactual will still hold, right? The algorithm does everything for you. You just input the data. You don't have to worry about assigning dates yourself. There's a little bit of questions, what I was meaning when I was like referring to choosing Japan. You don't know if in Japan there was like a shock that might have impacted this. And so if you don't consider that shock after the intervention, because you're just drawing the same data before the intervention, the same weight and after, that shock is also impacted the difference between your counterfactual and your actual trend. And so that's why limiting it to Europe is better, and to the Eurozone is better.
Santiago, so I have a question. Why did you choose synthetic control as your main methodology, and how do you work on? So my understanding is that synthetic control has the same problems as, let's see, matching. That is that you cannot see the unobservable variables. And it is so your question remains why these countries don't have, like in this case, caretaker governments. So you might ask yourself, okay, is this as randomly as possible? It's just because history just did it that way, or they genuinely thought that was not the best idea given their countries. Therefore, you cannot, like, if you cannot capture that unobservable variable that is making these countries not to be caretaker governments, you cannot say like he's the perfect counterfactual for yourself. So how are you working on this, and what are your main thoughts?
Yeah, those are very good points that you brought up. In a sense, it's a little bit different because you don't choose to have a caretaker government. It happens because of usually every 4 years when there's elections in Europe, that's the case. So you don't really get to choose like, let's have a caretaker government. And that's why the comic at the beginning was like, if caretaker government was an option, I would elect it. But it's not an option. When you refer to those biases of why these countries might have caretaker governments and not, that's based on their constitution, which was done years ago. They're parliamentary democracies, and so there wasn't during this time like any different country that switched to a parliamentary democracy and stuff like that. I think you might also be referring to like polarization between each country, and so that is something that you can't really control for. But the strength of the synthetic control is that you're relying on how close the counterfactual before the intervention is to the actual trend. And that's a very strong, in this case, it's like a very strong counterfactual. If you're using, let's say, a difference in difference method that has a lot of different requirements that are not always met, especially when you're comparing countries. If you're comparing, let's say, in this case, Belgium to Spain, Belgium and Spain are very different countries. And so, you don't really know for certain if those requirements meet. And this is usually what researchers have been relying on lately. In the case of Abadi, the first time he introduced it, he spoke about the terrorism, the ETA terrorism in Spain. And so he looked at, there was a group in Spain in the northeast that wanted to separate. And so they created a terrorist group, and that was putting bombs and doing kidnaps in that region. And so the GDP per capita, he shows that the GDP per capita changed for that region compared. It's very difficult, to compare the Basque region to Catalonia, to Madrid, to Valencia. And so he created this mixture between these different regions. And that's basically the strength of the synthetic control, that you don't really know. You don't have like a ton of different controls, but the strength lies in this gap between the synthetic control unit and the treated unit. And in this case, it's practically non-existent. You can see here, for example, if you subtract one from the other, that it's very close to zero. So there's really no, what I want to show here is that there wasn't like like caretaker governments weren't like as amazing as some journalists were saying, that the economy was growing and whatever. We really don't see any difference from what we had expected. In this case, I address it using a GDP per capita instead of GDP. And you see again the very similar, it's pretty close to the trend. In this case, you see that the synthetic control kind of differs a little bit from the treated unit. And then you here as well, right? And so what I want to address is this here. We don't see this like skyrocketing, right? And so we don't really see that impact from the caretaker government, where you see the GDP per capita going from 40,000 to 42,000, let's say, or 33,000. The very small increase.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I have a question. I think it's just a comment that I think when you do this kind of graphs, you should add also the confidence intervals, because even though if they are very close, there is like, for instance, I don't know, like 2008, I think there is a big jump that could be a threat for your.
That's a great point. Synthetic controls don't have any confidence intervals yet.
But there is no,
there are people developing
like
it.
a kind of bootstrapping or something in that sense.
Yeah, I'll show later on what I want to do, but that's a great point. Yeah, consider it. I'm gonna show it later on. But until now, Matías Cataneo and Titiniuk in Princeton developed like a type of confidence interval just like a month ago or something like that, or a few months ago, I think. So it's very recent. So I don't even know if Stata has the code for that. We'll see. Next case is the case of Netherlands in 1977, where they were 10 months without a government. And again, with a caretaker government, and again, you see that the treated unit and the synthetic control match very closely. Something that I'm gonna add one is like this difference over here is like $100 out of like 40,000. And so there's just no way to attribute that $100 increase in a synthetic control to the caretaker government, right? To the treatment. Forget about all this doesn't matter, but this is what really matters over here. That's right before and right after the caretaker government. And you see again that it's fairly close to each other. In the case of Spain, 2015 to 2016, I'm not very happy with the synthetic control right now. I'm gonna explore other countries to include or exclude. You can see here that I'm not very comfortable again here, because the synthetic control throughout is not as good. And if you scale it again, you see that it's very close to each other. If you just move this a little bit, I have to work more on this synthetic control to figure out if there is an effect or not in Spain. If there could have been an effect, that's very little, I don't know. So this is something that I'm continually working on Spain. it's very hard to analyze the Spanish government if anyone is considering doing something like that. The same thing with the per capita GDP. There's a gap here. I'm not very comfortable with the synthetic control per se. And so this is something that I'm continually working on to improve it. And so how do I improve this? I add other countries, I subtract some, I just play around with this to try to get the closest synthetic control, counterfactual pre the intervention. But then as Sarah said before, you really have to consider these other factors that are happening in the country. You can't just include Japan and be like, you can replicate Spain's GDP with 0.5, with a weight of 0.5 of the GDP of Japan or something like that. So why have I not found any effect? One explanation that I read from qualitative literature, there's some qualitative literature about this, is that in Europe, and especially in Belgium and Spain, and I'm not sure yet about Netherlands, but the most relevant governments are the local and regional ones. So in Catalonia, the most important government is the Catalan government rather than the Spanish government. And it's most relevant to day-to-day decisions, right? And the larger government focuses on other bigger stuff that really do not impact day-to-day life. Another
sorry,
one?
Santiago, yeah, related to that, do you know if that happens also at local level, like caretaker local governments? And maybe you can have,
that's a great question.
if you get information in local governments having this kind of issue, you can have like more power to.
Yeah. That's an excellent point, Juan. I'm looking at local governments. It doesn't seem to be very common in local governments. And that might be because local politicians and people realize that it might impact people more if they have a caretaker government. I'm not sure. That's a hypothesis. But I haven't found much evidence in Spain. The only caretaker governments that have happened are during, that I was considering Catalonia, during the time that Puigdemont was kicked out. And you can't really analyze that and attribute it to a caretaker government because there was just so much volatility in many different things. A lot of companies just left. And so it's very hard to do that. But I'm continually looking for local examples. If anyone living in Europe has one, let me know. Another one is that Europe and these countries in particular Belgium and Netherlands, have well-established services and pillars of life like healthcare, education, infrastructure, and government salaries and whatever. And so they can just go on and on without really needing a president. They have also well-established economic institutions, and in a sort of way, at least for the 2 of the 3 examples, they are sort of piggybacking on the European Union. So if any big legislation needs to be done, it's done in Europe. And so those are some of the theories that I am continually exploring, and I'm gonna talk later on about how I am exploring those. Conclusion of the 3 examples is that there's no evidence of short-term negative or positive impact. And I think the correct interpretation of how to think about this is that, you don't see these booms or busts with caretaker governments. You just don't see like, whoa, a caretaker government is here, everything is more efficient, the economy is running better. You don't really see that. Also the other way around. I'm also interested in why the post-intervention counterfactuals closely resemble actual trends. Suppose that government finally chose a president, they formed an alliance, and so you would think that they're very happy and they want to pass legislation to boost the economy, maybe add some stimulus. That does not happen. It has to do, I read some comments of people, of some political scientists saying that these alliances that form presidents are still very weak. And so if someone decides to not support one legislation, then, that's it. So those are theories that I'm exploring in a qualitative way. I'll explain later on. I began this because I was very curious to see whether these governments had an impact or not. And then later on, I discovered that someone had already done the job for me. They did the same exact methodology. They only limited it to Belgium. And they showed that in the case of Belgium, not only was there no evidence of an economic deterioration, so that we agree in, but they say the country's economic growth was actually higher than that of the counterfactual. And so in this, we disagree. I'm interested in knowing why we disagree, and I'm exploring, why we could possibly disagree. My theory has to be with the construction of the synthetic control. Something that Juan had brought up earlier on is adding some type of confidence intervals. And I mentioned, there's some people like Cataneo and company who are developing that. There's also Jesse Rothstein, who came up with a very important paper a couple of weeks ago. And so this is a very recent, progress on the methodology, the things that we think about when we think about difference in differences and confidence intervals. We don't have that yet well developed for asymptotic control. But I plan to start introducing those to my project. I agree with Balate and Bell, who wrote that paper on Belgium using the same exact methodology, in that future research needs to analyze other countries, to ascertain whether any common patterns emerge from different government formation deadlocks event. Something that I am also considering is looking at other variables. Maybe you might have some comments on other outcomes of interest, like labor force participation rate, the volume of stock exchanges, government services qualities, and employment. The problem with the synthetic control, the main disadvantage is that it's not good for volatility, and a lot of these things have relative volatility, like unemployment might go from 2.5 to 2.7 to 2.4, 2.6, and so overall trend might be like declining, but you still see a little bit of volatility, and that's not good for the synthetic control. Other countries that are not in Europe, Cambodia and Iraq are the only ones that I discovered have these very big periods with caretaker governments, but it's also very messy because the Iraq caretaker government happened during the Iraq invasion. Cambodia's caretaker government happened with like a minor disruption in the government functioning, and it has to do with the military, I think so.
Aja kindly reminds you that Bolivia is actually having, I don't know if they already finished, but currently.
They had the election.
Yeah,
they had the election like October last year, I think, but they had an interim government for about a year when Evo Morales left the country, so that might be
That's a very good point, yeah. Thank you. On the other thing, there's Sidney Taro, who's like a political scientist, very well known. He said something that I really like, is he said that the synthetic control method allows researchers to put qualitative flesh on quantitative bones. So as Juan had mentioned, we don't have these confidence intervals yet well developed. It's more to put this qualitative flesh on quantitative bones. And we still have to rely a lot, and I want to really exploit this qualitative flesh side. And I was thinking maybe how could I do this? Maybe interviewing officials and experts, scholars, journalists, to really understand what was going on in the government functioning and what people were thinking. Juan had mentioned perceptions from the people. But I really want to rely on this like qualitative flesh side. I think is very important for this project. And sorry for rushing at the end. I just want to leave some space for discussion. I really like this comic. It says, "Stop, wait, government's no longer the problem, it's the solution." But yeah, and thank you very much to the RAISE team for having me.
Thank you very much, Santiago, for your presentation. Does anyone have any kind of question? So this is just on his early stage, so everything is welcome. And it is really interesting. I do think your paper kind of has this taste on Abadia's one from the ETAs, and that's really cool. And yeah, Daniel raised his hand. Maybe Daniel, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Thanks everyone from RAISE, and of course, thanks Santiago for the really interesting topic. And I was thinking while you presented about the method, right, the synthetic controller, it raised lots of questions. And from what I understand of the method, it really relies on the type of outcome that you are looking at, right? Like you select a bunch of covariates that are going to predict this outcome. And from this kind of prediction, you basically give different weights to this kind of donor pool. So like if someone in the donor pool basically approximates well the country that you are interested in, it gains like higher weight. So what I was thinking is that, well, as these kind of caretaker governments can be like kind of short by definition, right? They are not supposed to stay like for 2-3 years. Something that would be nice to look at is like an outcome with more frequency. And while GDP is like only measured once per year, and maybe you can take a look into more micro-founded outcomes, such as firm entry, number of workers employed in a country. I mean, the stock of workers should not vary a lot, but I mean, the unemployment rate can vary. So I know that you are worried about the frequency, but I would say that you should go for something that you can have data to predict the outcome. So I will go for totally micro-founded data. In the sense that GDP, like there's monetary policy interactions that would be kind of difficult to measure in a proper way. Like people are doing this in macro in a very, very different way that we approach synthetic control methods. And about the selection on the covariates, Sarah raised a really important question, which is about how you can try to do a selection on observables. But of course, you have this kind of problem of selection on unobservables as well. And what I would suggest is taking a look at a recent paper from Marcelo Medeiros and Ricardo Massini. It came out on the Journal of Business and Statistics, I guess, and it's called Artificial Counterfactual. It's ARCO, the name, and they basically apply like machine learning methods to choose which are the best predictors in the pool of the covariates that you put in the method. And of course, the paper that is coming out in the American Economic Review, like it's a forthcoming one from Dmitry Arkhangelski, and it's using an assay which relates to differences and synthetic control, trying to bring the strengths of the two methods and making a doubly robust estimator. I think this is going to be like really, we are going to see tons of applied papers using this method really soon. And well, yes, and just a different thing would be like, well, if you can, I mean, this is more related to political economy actually, is how can you try to investigate the formation, like, well, elections happen, and then depending on the outcome of this election, either you have the realization of a caretaker government or not, like depending on the time that it takes to form a coalition, right? So what I would suggest is trying to investigate the election outcomes and seeing if you can sort of find a random, I mean, I'm not sure how to say this, but I mean, in short elections, for example, like, yeah, I'm in my head, it's like a regression discontinuity design in which, well, below the threshold, there is no caretaker government, and above the threshold, there is a caretaker government. I mean, is this kind of discontinuity something available in the data? Can you try to disentangle this? I mean, I think this would be a great addition to the paper. But I mean, this is just general comments, and I think the question is super interesting. Thanks a lot for the opportunity of hearing this.
Thank you, Daniel. Those are like excellent points. I've written everything. I just discovered the Susan Affy paper last week, and I haven't understand it yet. I don't understand it yet, but she wrote it, so it's gonna be very big, I suppose. And then the other thing is that I'm limited by, and the other people, Cataneo and Jesse Rothstein, have also been using machine learning. I'm limited in this project in terms that I'm not a political scientist and I don't know nothing about political science. I'm an economist, and so I do have, and that's why I say I really want to rely on qualitative stuff to really understand, you know, how these governments work and stuff. But yeah, those are very good points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for those comments. Does anyone else have a couple of comments or maybe suggestions? Okay, then thank you everyone for joining us. Today was like a kind of a special meeting, and we encourage you to work on this. If you want to present just a paper that is just coming up, this is a great space, because what we are trying to encourage you is to like like have this network where you can ask, and these are those kind of spaces. So thank you very much, Santiago. If anyone has questions, you can write him down. Like you can write your email if you want, Santiago, here, so people can ask you things or maybe give you some comments. And also on the Discord channel, you can like write and ask him. We are all in the Discord channel. I don't know, Nicolas, if you want to add something.
I'm just gonna add that I was very nervous to come and everything went well, so thank you. And if you're nervous to present, don't worry, it's very friendly group.
Okay.
Thank you, Santiago. No, this is the idea of Race. Like, we create this seminar to give the space for young researchers like us to come here, present their ideas, projects, and everything, and have good feedback. And yeah, try to create this group of people that is like doing, I don't know, research assistancy, pre-docs, and everything to come to this space and present. So we are, for those who were not before, like, this is a like kind of new space, and we are doing these seminars each Wednesday. Actually, and we have booked a lot of Wednesdays before, but next one.
We already have someone.
Huh?
Camilo de los Rios will be presenting his work.
Yeah.
I don't know, Camilo, if you want to give us something about it, like something to digest.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see this happening. Yeah, to digest, I'm gonna talk about the human capital costs of oil exploitation in Colombia. Very cool paper that I'm working on now with my team at the IDB. So hope to see you there and get some great feedback from you.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, Santiago, for not attending the whole meeting. I was on another call and had to get out. It was really nice paper, the parts that I saw.
Okay, thank you very much, and see you in 15 days with Camilo's presentation. Bye.